Good evening, good morning to some of you, good afternoon, wherever you are. We have people coming to us from a number of different time zones. So from wherever you're coming, welcome. I am Bob Shine, New Ways Ministries Associate Director, and I welcome you on behalf of our Executive Director, Frank DiBernardo, and co-founder, Sister Janine Gramick. We are most grateful that you're taking the time to join us for the next 75 minutes to discuss the implications of the Vatican's latest declaration, Dignitas Infinita, on human dignity, that had many wonderful things, a wonderful rationale for human dignity, but had very negative sections about gender theory and gender transitions. So tonight we have a panel to discuss not only what's in the document and what its implications might be, but how we as LGBTQ plus Catholics and allies can respond and continue our pastoral initiatives in the wake of this document. Before we begin, I want to give two brief announcements. First, given the format of this webinar, only the panelists will be able to be seen or heard. So you won't be on camera and you won't have a mic if you're tuning in and not one of the panelists. The second thing is, because we want to give folks an opportunity to have their questions answered, throughout the program, there is the Q&A function in Zoom where you can submit questions. And after the panelists give their opening remarks, we'll have a period for questions and answers, and we'll try to get through as many of those as possible. Some folks have pre-submitted questions too. There's never enough time, but we try to sort of group them together to get through as much content as possible, knowing that with this declaration, there is a lot more to be said, but we'll start on it tonight. And at the end, I'll mention a few other resources that are available. Before I introduce tonight's moderator, I'd like to start by having us enter a moment of prayer. And I actually want to use a part of the document, Dignitas Infinita, for this prayer, because as I mentioned, its defense of human dignity is wonderful. It's just its failure to apply it fully to LGBTQ people that we're left to reckon with. So as we call to mind the presence of God with us here tonight, read the opening words from the declaration. Every human person possesses an infinite dignity, inalienably grounded in their very being, which prevails in and beyond every circumstance, state, or situation the person may ever encounter. This principle, which is fully recognizable even by reason alone, underlies the primacy of the human person and the protection of human rights. In the light of Revelation, the Church resolutely reiterates and confirms the ontological dignity of the human person, created in the image and likeness of God and redeemed in Jesus Christ. From this truth, the Church draws the reasons for her commitment to the weak and those less endowed with power, always insisting on the primacy of the human person and the defense of their dignity beyond every circumstance. I'd now like to turn it over to tonight's moderator, Brian Flanagan, who is New Ways Ministries Senior Fellow. Brian will be introducing the panelists and also fielding questions. So, Brian, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Bob, and it's great to see so many people here, to have you listening and learning with us. And once again, if you see, depending on your system, at the bottom of your screen under the Q&A function, that's a way of adding questions as the conversation continues. And as Bob just said in the second portion of our conversation tonight, I'll be drawing questions from all of you and from questions that were pre-submitted to help spark some continuing conversation and further depth with our panelists. We have three excellent speakers tonight who have experience, who have thought, who have depth, who have thought about this document, but also been thinking about the realities and the experiences of our transgender, non-binary, and intersex siblings in Christ for a while. So I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they'll be speaking, and then let them each speak for a few minutes, and then after that we'll go back to some more direct questioning. Our first speaker tonight will be Therese Lysaught, who uses she, her pronouns. Therese is professor at the Neiswanger Institute for Bioethics and Health Policy at the Stritch School of Medicine, School of Medicine and the Institute of Pastoral Studies at Loyola University of Chicago. She's also a member of the Pontifical Academy for Life, and her books, including Catholic Bioethics and Social Justice, Bridge Theology, Bioethics, Medicine, Social Justice, and Catholic Healthcare. Craig Ford, who uses he, him pronouns, is assistant professor of theology and religious studies at St. Norbert College in Des Peres, Wisconsin. He also serves on the faculty at the Institute of Black Catholic Studies at Xavier University of Louisiana, the nation's only Catholic, historically Black college university. Craig writes on topics at the intersection of gender, race, sexuality, and the Catholic moral tradition. And our third speaker will be Max Kuzma, who uses he, him pronouns. Max is a transgender man living on a farm in rural Ohio, who writes and speaks and gives us so much wisdom about affirming the dignity of LGBTQ plus people in all areas of life, and most particularly within the Catholic Church. So those will be our three speakers, and I'll turn it over to Therese to get our comments started.
All right, thanks, Bob and Brian and Bob, both for the introduction and for inviting me to join this conversation tonight. I know I have 7 minutes, so we want to get right to it. If you're here tonight joining us for this conversation, I'm guessing that you, like me, found Dignitas Infinita to be a painfully disappointing document. So I thought I'd start our conversation by framing up the trajectory of the document and discussing how that in itself set up both some of the internal problems with the document itself, as well as the disappointment that it generated. As I think you know, Dignitas Infinita is the first time the Vatican has made an authoritative statement on the novel, complex, and politically fraught topics surrounding transgender people. The 2014 statement by the then Congregation for Education at the Vatican, entitled Male and Female, He Created Them, didn't really have any authoritative status. It applied only to K through 12 education, and it did not address medical issues. So here, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, by which I will refer to as the DDF going forward, had an extraordinary opportunity to do a careful, thorough, conceptual, doctrinal, and pastoral analysis of a really important topic that is polarizing the church and public discourse. That is what was needed. And that is what was widely hoped for. Now, why did anyone think that that would happen? Because on the one hand, we've seen extraordinary documents come out of this papacy. Lumen Fide, Evangelii Gaudium, Laudato Si, Samaritanus Bonum, I could go on. These are all beautiful documents, craftfully done, scientifically informed where they need to be, theologically rich, well written. So we know they can do it. Additionally, as you may also know, from the beginning of his papacy, Pope Francis has repeatedly called for a change in how the church does theological analysis, especially of moral issues. In August 2013, in his very first interview with Anthony Spadaro, he criticized Catholic moral theology, lamenting its undue focus on small-minded rules, its excessively narrow and decontextualized method. These are his words. In Evangelii Gaudium, he called out, quote, a legalist obsession with the transmission of a disjointed multitude of doctrines to be imposed insistently, rooted in a past that no longer exists. Over the past 2 years, he has spoken to this issue of theological method more and more specifically. And then last fall, he formalized all of this in the motu proprio Ad Theologiam Promovendum, which translated means to advance or promote theology, where he outlined basic requirements for a competent theological analysis. These requirements included dialogue, careful engagement with all the sciences, and careful engagement with the perspectives of those people who have firsthand knowledge of whatever issue is being discussed. In his words, contextual theology. So these are all hallmarks of his papacy. In the meantime, he replaced the head of the DDF with Cardinal Fernandez and revamped its membership and structure. So all the signs were pointing in the direction that if the Vatican took up the issue of transgender persons, and particularly transgender medical care, they would do a competent and maybe even a really interesting job. Dignitas Infinita would have been the perfect opportunity for Pope Francis, Cardinal Fernandez, and the DDF to demonstrate what the method outlined in Ad Promovendum might have looked like. And in large part because of that document, I presumed that he would require them to do it. But apparently he didn't, because they surely didn't. Dignitas Infinita couldn't be further from all of his counsel about how to do theology, or from most professional standards for how to do theology. So why? How do we account for this? Here, I think Cardinal Fernandez's presentation at the beginning of the document is helpful, because here we see at least part of the problem. As he indicates, the document went through, as I count them, 7 different drafts, the 6th of which was approved by the DDF prior to his appointment as the head of the dicastery in July 2023. So he inherited this document. Sources suggest that this approved document focused primarily, if not solely, on the usual narrow list of bioethics and culture war issues. And I'm going to guess that's probably what is in paragraphs 47 through 60. Pope Francis, however, asked that the document be amended to incorporate insights from at least Fratelli Tutti. And so, as Fernandez notes, they had to go back and redraft the document, cutting material at the beginning and expanding the list of issues. They basically had to rewrite the thing. This explains why Dignitas Infinita reads like 2 documents, maybe more, shaped by very different perspectives and methodologies that are essentially cut and pasted together. We can do a deeper dive into these various pieces in the Q&A, particularly looking at how they're at odds with each other. But from my perspective, what we see in this document is a distillation of ongoing theological conflicts in the church. And rather than being patient and taking the time to resolve these differences, instead of taking the time for scientific and clinical questions to be studied sufficiently, instead of exercising any of the Christian virtues of prudence, peacemaking, charity, temperance, solidarity, they rushed ahead with a document that is badly written, demonstrates that they don't have the most basic understanding of the topics that they're talking about, and will very likely amplify the harm that is being done to transgender people via legislation and diocesan policies that deeply violate their dignity. To be clear, they did have other options, right? They could have not released a document, which would have actually been the best course of action. They could have released a document that reviewed the scientific and clinical evidence and said, it looks like there's disagreements. The theological opinions are split. So at this time, maybe we can't give a positive affirmation to all these medical interventions, but we're open to revising this position in light of new evidence. That would have been a conservative position, but also potentially reasonable, depending on how they did it. But they didn't. They didn't choose these courses of action. Instead, just as Pope Francis said to Spadaro in 2013, they issued yet another document in which, quote, faith becomes an ideology among other ideologies. Thanks.
Thank you, Therese, for those powerful opening ways of beginning to get a handle on the complexity of this document and, frankly, some of the failures of this document. Our next speaker is Craig Ford of St. Norbert College.
Good evening, everyone. And once again, I want to also express my gratitude for everyone who's come out tonight, and also to Brian and Bob for the invitation. Some of my comments that I want to mention here also echo some of the comments that Therese mentioned just earlier. I think there are 3 points that I'd like to make overall. One is to really talk about things that I think we can appreciate in this document, and also highlight some of the things that are really, and you'll find a significant term for me, messy about this document, because I think it can point us to maybe pathways for those of us who are teachers, those of us who are ministers, those of us who are serving various pastoral roles. It might give us a path to making something constructive from this moment that we find ourselves in, responding to this document. As Bob read at the beginning as the prayer, there's a beautiful thing in declaring that everyone has dignity, and that dignity should be defended at all costs. I'm particularly taken back and really appreciate the detail that the document attempts to go into when it tries to understand all of the demands of what dignity looks like, based in this idea that we are in relation with one another, right? And that part of what that dignity looks like has to have a specific socio-political realization, right? In order to honor our dignity as human beings, we have to be able to make use of our rights. We have to be full participants in the society in which we find ourselves. And we also have to have our basic needs taken care of. And I think that's really important to highlight in a world that seems to be so overcome with scarcity and seems to be on the brink of war in so many places. I also think you can see in comments here, as Therese talked about, some of Francis's major priorities here, especially drawing attention to the fact that people who are living with disabilities do not always receive dignified care. I think that's an important emphasis. Migrants don't always get their dignity honored when they appear looking to move into new homes and new places. And obviously, of course, people living in poverty and war. These things and violence, right? These situations all are challenges that Francis asks us, and that the Vatican, the Church, is asking us, how do we engage these realities in ways that do promote that dignity? I also appreciate in the document how we hear about freedom and trying to honor people's freedom insofar as they need to learn how to seek the truth. I think that echoes parts of what we see at the Second Vatican Council, especially in Dignitas Humanae, which asks for us to use our freedom to find the truth. But we also see other ways in which freedom can be problematized, and problematized in ways that have hurt, right? So I want to appreciate things that I think are here. I think that first half of the document that we see on dignity is something that merits our attention, merits, as Bob illustrated, our prayer. And I think it also merits us continuing to reflect on where in our lives can we more deeply honor the human dignity of everyone that we come across in the world today. I think that's big. And as Therese mentioned, there is this element of writing that I've sometimes called the Vatican juxtaposition. And what this means is you see in the form of the document evidence of contrary agendas at the same time, right? So Therese talked about how you put some of these things together and you wonder, some of these are Francis priorities, some of these seem to be other priorities, right? This is something we saw a lot in some of the Vatican II documents, where you would see one line saying one thing, another line saying another thing, and then everyone have to figure out how to interpret it. There's one big juxtaposition, right, between this theoretical section on dignity and then what seems to be a selection of issues that sometimes makes it difficult to determine what rationale draws them all together, right? And that's, of course, when you return to this idea of, well, maybe what makes all these ideas come together is the fact that they reflect competing priorities and competing directions. I think this juxtaposition essentially leads to a messiness that we see in the document. And that's where I want the crux of my comments to be. One of the things that my friends and I sometimes say about documents we read is that document is a cold mess, document's a hot mess. When we think about messes, I think that leads us to appreciate, but also to critique. So in those two modes, right? How is releasing a document that is messy a bad thing, right? It's messy to the extent, right, that we see a document that in its treatment of issues important to LGBTQ plus people, especially gender, transgender, and gender non-binary folks, you see a document that doesn't reflect a consultative process, right? You see a document that is produced in an echo chamber of teaching that we have seen emerge and calcify over the last few decades. And you wonder, where are the people? Where are the sources? Where is the church in conversation with other people, right? The fact that that's not happening is going to cost us credibility in the larger world. It's going to cost the Vatican credibility in the larger conversation, because as Therese mentioned, the church has had time to begin to think about these things. The church has the opportunity to withhold judgment, to say that it's studying, but it declines to do so, right? And so the messiness of this is that at a place in a document that has had such a long trajectory, we have a document that still has a number of elements that don't reflect the process of writing well, or writing knowing that you're writing into a world that is polarized in ways that are both within a certain geographic context, but certainly across the world. We see that polarization, and there's a responsibility there. And to not do that means you're releasing something that is messy, right? So I know we have a lot of time to talk about this document. I want to make sure we have time to just hear your questions and what you want to speak about. But I also want to offer that messiness can be a bit of a constructive space as well, right? For many of us who have studied or followed Pope Francis, we recognize that Francis, while he has opened up a very constructive space for us in the church, namely the synodal process, right? Trying to bring us together, to be in meetings with one another, to listen to one another, to try to talk about where we're going to be in the next years as a church, right? He has opened up this space, but there are many ways in which when we look at his own stated views, right, on questions, he often doesn't give the answer or present the answer that many progressive Catholics would find heartening, right? Especially when it comes to gender, especially when it comes to sexuality. So these positions that end up in the second half of the document, you can wonder whose priorities are being put forward here, but sometimes you can also say Francis himself has a complicated worldview, and in some of his published statements where he has, in certain letters, apostolic letters, has issued things that are challenging to the dignity of trans people, the LGBTQ plus people, he does that. That is what he's done in prior documents, right? But when you put those two things together, right, Francis being willing to, as he does, issue and share with the world his views on questions, and you hold that in tension with the fact that he's trying to create this constructive space for people to disagree, I think we need to, as Catholics, see this as a moment to live in and step into that space, that constructive space that tries to look at the messiness of our community, the messiness of this document, and try to bring the light that comes from our community discernment to this conversation. I think we need, especially as pastoral ministers, to be encouraged to share this document, to talk about this document, to talk about the tensions, to model and continue to think, how do we offer a compelling vision, a more compelling vision that builds on what is good, but then continues to advance us to the fullness of what we might want to see in a document that defends human dignity for all of us. So I think if we can take the messiness of this document, acknowledge that its messiness, right, is really has a very difficult dimension attached to it, given that when you don't consult trans people, when you don't consult LGBTQ plus people, when you don't consult many people who are pursuing some of the activities that are condemned by the document, you run the risk of actually exacerbating the discrimination and the harm that goes against these communities, right? That messiness needs to be called out, right? But then also, I think there's a messiness that is the constructive posture that many of us have had to learn how to work through, especially as LGBTQ Catholics in a church, in our church. How do we take that and use it to build constructive conversations, to think about building a document that, or thinking about finishing a document in a way that has a stronger ending than the one that we see right now? So that's what I would say are some of the first comments I'd like to make, right, in this document, right? There are things to appreciate, things to build on. How do we as Catholics, LGBTQ plus Catholics, as progressive Catholics, add the ending that we need to see? Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you for reminding us of the potential grace of messiness as well. I think that's the some of the Christian story is about making the best out of a bad situation and making best out of the freedom that that messiness allows us. So thank you. Our third speaker is Max Kuzma. Max, if you want to go ahead.
All right, thank you so much. Yes, so as a transgender person, I would just like to begin by acknowledging the way that a document like this impacts transgender Catholics in the church. It's a very heavy emotional subject and something that really impacts people. When the document first came out, I actually got text messages from Catholic friends who were basically warning me, like, be in a good space before you approach looking at this, because it is difficult when the way that the church speaks about the community appears to not have taken that community into account. And so there are a few things that I'd like to cover, and I want to kind of go into that emotional labor portion of expecting transgender people to kind of pick up the slack about some of these things, or expecting LGBTQ people to be able to like make sense of this, be able to figure out how we can still participate in the church when we're dealing with this messiness, as Craig said. And then I would also just like to end with three aspects of the document that I think we should empower allies with information about, that they can be voices to speak up about these things in a more informed way. So I think one big thing for me in general is on a scientific side. They mention in the document scientific coherence. To me, the diversity of creation speaks to God's love of diversity. And so that is just a really important point to me, because everybody has something to give, and it's our unique gifts. It's part of that greater picture of diversity. As far as my 3 points, I would like to start by talking about the phrase gender theory. That phrase really stood out to me, because when it comes to the terminology used to discuss any group of people, but especially a marginalized group of people, it's pretty important to listen to the language that the community uses itself. Like, what do actual transgender people, what are the words that we use? And gender theory was an immediate little red flag in my mind, because that is a term that is pretty politically loaded. It's a term that's kind of emerged recently. It's a funny thing, because of course transgender people have existed as long as there have been people, just as gay people have existed as long as there have been people. Like, we have always been here. And then but it's this modern recent, I would say the modern craze is kind of the hysteria about transgender people. And I have a quote here from Judith Butler, who is a professor, thinker, philosopher on the topic of gender theory. And the quote is, "The turn against gender is a way of shoring up a traditional sense of place and privilege." And they kind of go into more detail about that. But it's kind of this anxiety that LGBTQ people, kind of specifically trans people right now, present a threat to like the way things are. So I would just say, so as far as, making this more practical for what allies can take from this, I would just say it's important that we underscore the importance of using our language. And that includes, obviously, I know we all know this, it includes using pronouns and the correct name for people, and just that level of basic respect of, we should be able to push back and say, if we're going to talk about this community, we should be using the language that the community uses. So that's my first point. My second point is coming back to the science. So this idea that, well, I'll just read it exactly how they say it. Regarding gender theory, whose scientific coherence is the subject of considerable debate among experts. That also raised a red flag for me, because I noticed they don't specify who the experts are. And that's pretty important, because all major modern medical associations, WPATH, the science is pretty much saying, trans people are who they say they are. Trans healthcare saves lives. Like, we have the statistics, and we understand this. So to put a statement like that in this document really troubled me. And I think that's an important place where we can push back as well, because there are, in the political sphere, a lot of self-appointed experts, people who there are examples of people who would, for example, do a study where they only talk to the parents of transgender people, and then they make various claims speaking for all transgender people. So I think that is a pretty important like weak point here that we can very much push back on. And yeah, that's just that's just a good one to push on. And then lastly, I would like to talk about the last part at the end of the sex change portion, where they mention, I'll just read it to you again to make it easier. This is not to exclude the possibility that a person with genital abnormalities that are already evident at birth or that develop later may choose to receive the assistance of healthcare professionals to resolve these abnormalities. However, in this case, such a medical procedure would not constitute a sex change in the sense intended here. Okay, so this part also set up a red flag for me, because this is pretty clearly talking about the intersex community, but again, does not at all seem to take into account how that community would think or talk about their experiences. And that's extremely important, especially in the intersex community. I cannot speak about it authoritatively because I am not intersex, but the point is that, just as transgender people are not a monolith, or gay people, or anybody else in the spectrum, it's the same for intersex people, and just there's definitely an irony there of, we're allowing it in this case when the doctors that we approve of are making the decisions we approve of, kind of. Essentially, intersex people may fall anywhere in the gender spectrum. They may wish to have some form of surgery or some adjustment to their hormones or things like that, but they may not. And having somebody making that decision for them before, when they are a child, is just not what, again, the medical community sees as the right path for the thriving of intersex people. So I think those are three very simple but very easy ways that we can push back a little bit as allies, and to be informed about those issues, and honestly to also seek out greater understanding. I grew up in a very conservative Catholic world where I didn't have access or exposure to LGBTQ identities at all. And so I had to take time over years, even as I was understanding my own identity, to engage with the community and to become more educated. And so, speaking to the positive mobilizing that we can do here, I would say that's a great example where we can continue to seek out the voices of the people that are actually being discussed and amplifying those voices, because that is just the key to actually respecting the dignity of all people.
Thank you, Max. Thank you for your words. Thank you for that call to start thinking about how our learning can become a way of acting. And also, I'm really touched, and I think it's so important to think. And I think one of the reasons people were so disappointed with this document is the Vatican seems to have made some strides on calling people by the names by which they call themselves, except here. And so there was a bit of a jarring disconnect there. I want to remind everyone that we have space in the question and answer box to put some questions in, some things that I promise you we will not get to all of them, but we're collecting questions from there as well as from the questions submitted when people registered. And I'm going to be bringing some of those together now with our three panelists. And we're going to start with some questions that will seem more theoretical or about the sort of the nature and status of this document. And then I promise you that we will also move to questions that are also so important about our pastoral care, our ministry with our trans, non-binary, and intersex siblings, and what we can do as trans folks, as LGBTQ folks, as allies to help support them as this document is being received. So the first question I have is, in some ways, for all of our panelists, the DDF, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, has been rather busy in the last 8 to 9 months talking about LGBTQ plus issues. And in some ways, this is referred to in one of the questions that came in on the chat. In some ways, it's been a bit of a whiplash of, at one level, we have Fiducia Supplicans talking about the blessing of folks in same-gender relationships. We have the document last year about the relationship of the ability of trans folks to serve as godparents. In a responsum ad dubium. And then we have this document from 2 weeks ago. And so I think one question I think people have is, well, what's the status of this document ecclesially? What's the status of this teaching? Whose authority is here? And how should those of us who are Catholics who are trying to, we all know that the Vatican speaks is a noun and a verb that cover over many other complexities. So what are some of the ways that Catholics should be hearing or receiving this teaching, this document? And I'll let whoever wants to jump in on that.
Well, we should let the ecclesiologists talk about that, Brian and Craig.
I am the moderator. Craig, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, so as it comes from a Vatican dicastery, it shares in the teaching authority of the Pope. And in that regard, it's a teaching that we're supposed to, as it's articulated, learn it, study it, try to integrate it into our lives as all papal teaching, recognizing that it's offered in a sense of, okay, we're trying to offer this in a way that helps, right? But that doesn't mean we have to turn off our brains in the process. It's important always to say, okay, this teaching is being offered authoritatively. But my response is something that has to be discerned always within that sanctuary of one's conscience, right? That at the end of the day, we are obligated by Catholic teaching, if you don't know that, to follow our conscience and how it leads us to act as we do this, right? The obligation to do so comes by forming our conscience. And doing things like this is exactly what forming our consciences mean, right? Looking at the manifold ways in which this document is drawing on scripture, tradition, the sciences, and the experience of people. And you can say, oh, is this document really giving us all of those things? And if it isn't, can we bring that so that we can have so that we can form our consciences using those 4 sources, right? I think, as we've tried to show tonight, the document, while it shares in this authority of the Pope, it doesn't always seem to engage adequately all the sources that we need to be able to form our consciences adequately.
Thanks, Craig. And
yeah, if I could add, right. So there is also this sort of myth, right, that floats around that, anything the Pope says, he could be flying on a plane. It's instantly almost infallible, although it depends on which, if you like the Pope or if you don't like the Pope, but that's actually not the case, right? Infallible teachings in the church are rare. there is a sort of a hierarchy of authority in church documents, right? So documents of an ecumenical council have the highest level of authority, papal encyclicals or the apostolic constitutions, I can't remember, there's a list of like 10 different kinds of designations of documents that sort of indicates the authoritative level. So a declaration coming from the DDF and just, as Craig said, with the kind of the voice of the Pope, has a lot of authority, and with any like document from the Vatican, document from the magisterium, we should always take it seriously, engage with it, respect it, but respect can mean critique, right? You have to take the whole thing, right? So it's a matter of relationship. Like, how do you relate to a document? How do you integrate it into your faith? And that includes, as Craig said, your brain and your conscience, and prayer.
Thanks, Therese. Max, in your comments, you rightly, I think, raised up some of that many of the other sections of the document on poverty and on migration were full of footnotes. And there was this kind of absence talking about experts when it came to the section on gender identity and these kind of what Dan Horan on our blog last week referred to as sort of the straw man of this idea of gender theory. And Therese, you talked as well about the complicated history of this document, that it might have first started as something primarily focusing on gender theory, whatever that is, and gender identity before adding these other things. I mean, I guess the question I think a lot of people have, and I still have, is why did the DDF think that it needed to say something? Why at this point, when there seems to be, there may have been more time for study, but why did they write this document? Why did this document come through? And I'll ask anyone who wants to jump in on that to start first.
Don't have a charitable answer, so I probably shouldn't say it.
But you can be charitable and get direct.
Well, I mean, that's the question, right? Why would you say something like this badly at this time, right? When you maybe have other options. And the only reason I can think of is, for political reasons. And that's not good, right? So the USCCB came out with their absolutely horrible document last year. I've commented on that, right? There was nothing redeeming about that. There are redeeming points in this document. The USCCB is in the process of revising the ethical and religious directives for Catholic healthcare to include, this sort of draconian refusal to think about medical interventions related to transgender people because they don't believe transgender people exist, right? They reject the category, right? There have been, as you know, an increasing number of policies put forward by various dioceses in the United States, mostly, not mostly in other countries, that are also very draconian. I think we're up to like 52, 54 now. And absent any other reason, the only reason I can see is to support people with collars backing up people with collars. That's what I see. Because, for example, just to kind of affirm the point Max made about, consulting, whatnot, right? Today, Vatican PR is full of photos of the Vatican meeting with the leaders of AI tech companies, right? Because the Vatican is very interested in AI. They should be interested in AI. And as part of that interest in AI and developing AI ethics and developing policies, they have been consulting with leaders of AI companies for 5 years, bringing some really rich people to the Vatican to talk to them. So we know they can do it, but here they have chosen not to. So again, this is a critique that comes from their own practice. This is not an external critique. This is an internal critique. I would be happy with consistency.
Thanks, Therese. Max or Craig, I mean, why do you think that the Vatican didn't consult with transgender people before issuing this document, or consult with these experts that are out there who we know who are working at it, even if there are disagreements among those experts, as they say, that disagreement seems to be a whole different ball of wax than the statements that they made in Dignitas Infinita.
I don't have a long answer to this, but I think that it's because if they do that, then now they have to think about it more critically, it becomes more complicated. I felt a sense myself, without being a theologian and without necessarily having the most knowledge about all this, the inner workings of the Vatican. I felt a sense of, we are talking about it in this kind of keeping it at an arm's length, because then we don't have to get into all of it, and that's why I hammered so much on, I think we should push back on all of these things, because I really think that it's embarrassing to kind of have your head in the sand and kind of pretend that we don't have all of this information and all this understanding now. And especially, as Therese said, when they took so long to work on it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I totally affirm the political hypothesis, the politics hypothesis that Therese talks about. I mean, I think that's almost so clear from the juxtaposition of all of these different types of things, right? I don't think you could, I feel like I'd have a better chance of hitting the lottery than taking all these issues and grabbing the same exact sort that they pulled out of the list of issues, right? I think that's a question. I also think, though, and this may be a bit of an example that psychologizes a bit, right? The cost of inspecting the belief that's at the root of these issues is so high because of the spillover effects that it would have. If you challenge gender complementarity and gender essentialism within Catholic moral theology, you would almost sink the ship and you would have to build a new one. I mean, it is that core to how many of these teachings are being articulated this way. And to open up that door, I think to choose not to go through that door, I think explains why we have so few citations in these sections, and Fratelli Tutti and all those other things that in droves in other sections, right? The cost of inspecting the belief around gender and sexuality is a lot, and a lot of things are connected to it. Contraception, homosexuality, marriage. I mean, so many things are connected. And I think the costs are just too high.
Thanks, Craig. One last question that might help us transition from the questions around the nature of this document and its teaching to some of the questions about how this works out on the ground. Is there anything of value in this document? Not around necessarily the sections on so-called gender theory or on so-called sex change, but we did begin with a rather moving quotation from the document as a whole. What do you see that's of value, and perhaps contra the intentions of its original authors, what do you see of value precisely on the issue of promoting the dignity of transgender people, of non-binary folks, of intersex folks?
Well, I'll start again. Yeah, I didn't talk about any of the positives because I only had 7 minutes, so I had to get to the quick. But clearly, right, we have 50 paragraphs of really good material, right, about dignity, right? It's not very well written because they repeat themselves 7 times, but at least they hammer home the point about the importance of the infinite dignity of every human person, right? And that is actually getting pushback from the right? We're giving dignity to too many people. So apparently that section is really important. Trying to weave together now, a couple of people, Dennis Holzschneider was, I think, the first guy to get this into print, but a couple of people had said, where Cardinal Bernardine had come up with a consistent ethic of life, right? This is trying to craft a consistent ethic of dignity, which I thought was a really interesting idea. But I think if you do that, the internal weight of the document, the positives, critique the negatives, so that they have to collapse under the total weight of the argument. So that's a strength, right? As I won't go into this in great detail now because I'm I have written a piece on it that should come out on Friday in NCR. So there's a little, heads up, go read the full version. But if you read through the document, we get 55 paragraphs on the fundamental equality of all people and their fundamental ontological dignity of all people. Poor people, migrants, trafficked people, even women sometimes, et cetera, all these categories, right? Until you get to paragraph 56, and all of a sudden we are hammered over the head with difference. Gender difference, sexual difference, right? I mean, Craig is absolutely right. This is the core. This is the fundamental, this is the cornerstone of the building. And if you move that cornerstone, the whole thing's going to come down. And nobody trusts that God could actually rebuild that house if it came down from that problematic cornerstone. But the greater weight of the document itself argues against the contradiction that they have built into this document. So that to me is a plus. And as we've seen over time, sometimes, like for example, in this document, LGBTQAI people maybe have dignity finally at last. They're off in their own paragraph. But right, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, intersex people, they all have infinite dignity. That wasn't the case 10 years ago, right? In the documents coming out of the church. So that's, there is progress over time. That's a piece of progress.
Thanks, Therese. Craig or Max, do you want to add anything else on this? What you found that was valuable, perhaps, in this document?
Yeah. I mean, I think as you asked the question, Brian, it was what's specifically valuable for LGBT people, right? Not just like in general, but for LGBTQ plus people in particular. Is that right?
I think I'm open to however you want to take the question. Right? I mean, what's good in this document? What's good in this document, particularly when we think about either LGBTQ people more generally or about trans folks in particular?
Yeah. Something that I noticed that I appreciated about, for example, people who are, lesbian, gay, or bi, is that there was a call out about how wrong it is to torture and imprison people on the basis of their sexual orientation. And I think that is a statement that does matter. Maybe sometimes not so much in some of the North Atlantic region, but in certain countries around the world, that is a very, very important statement to hear and to incorporate. And I think that, I don't know, you might look at that and say, cool, you're saying don't imprison gay people. Great. Wow. What a great thing. I think that, so I just want to say, like, that's in the document in a way, and that puts some pressure on some of the ambiguous political advocacy of some bishops' conferences, for example, on the continent of Africa. It puts some pressure on that. And so I just think that matters in that respect. As you know, for my presentation, I really cared about highlighting how when we talk about dignity and talking about, especially people living with disabilities, especially there's a ways in which we can take those things and really amplify that, because sometimes we don't always see that amplified. So I would just add that one thing about, torture and imprisonment, but also append that to all the comments around, paying attention to poverty, making sure people have rights to participate in their society. I think these are still major things that people are trying to achieve around the world.
Thank you, Craig. I want to go deeper into some of the pastoral reality of this. And a question that we have in a few different ways in the chat and in a few different ways in emails is the very basic question is, after this document, are transgender Catholics welcome in our church? What does this do to that welcome? How do we put this together, the statements in this document, together with Pope Francis's statements that todos, todos, todos? And if they are welcome, or if they are to be welcomed, what are some practical ways? What are some ways that we make that clearer? If we're not necessarily on the dicastery of the doctrine of the faith, as far as I'm aware, so far that's not true. But for those of us working in parishes, working in ministries, working in universities, in communities, and hospitals, how do we make that welcome clearer? But so the first part is, are they welcome? Are our sisters and brothers and siblings welcome? And second, how do we make that clearer and amplify those voices?
I think unequivocally, yes, transgender people are welcome. I do think, as I said before, that the confusion, the confusing way that this document kind of, we know we're talking about trans people, but we're not like outright using the right terms. I do think that is an issue with the document. But as far as transgender people belonging in the church, yes, I very much feel that, and I actually see this document, like, even with all the flaws, as an opportunity to push forward with that, because it shows and it opens conversations around how we do that. And so I just, yeah, I say yes. And as far as practical steps towards that, I think it's, as I say, pushing against the unclarity here, and then just making it clear, making it clear that there is space when you are an ally. Like, again, using the right names and pronouns, using the right terminology for the community, just really, yeah, I just am a trans person. I love trans people. I see the gifts that we are to the church, and this doesn't discourage me too much, because I know that we are a gift to the church, and you look at any church anywhere, you will find trans people, and you will find trans people who are serving in churches doing amazing things. So just supporting those people in any way that we can.
What do you think? Go ahead, Therese, if you want, but I mean,
Yeah, I was just going to very briefly highlight the point that you made earlier, right? That a year ago we had a document affirming that trans folks can be godparents, right? So there we have a whole document that is addressing not the medical issues, right? This document, you know, people like to make a distinction between like bioethics and social ethics, and maybe this is actually trying to break that down. But this document entirely conceptualizes trans folks medically, right? It doesn't even talk about the pastoral issues, even though those are like big questions in these documents, these diocesan documents that are coming out. But we had a document a year ago, right, that said, yeah, trans people can even be godparents, not just welcomed into our church, they can actually be godparents, right? Have this really crucial liturgical, sacramental, spiritual role in the lives of children, or, you know, adults coming in through RCIA. So, you know, so that's a huge affirmation on the pastoral side, the parish side, that isn't addressed in this document, right?
thanks, Therese.
And also, I would just add, we also have the example of Pope Francis's actions towards the trans community and the way that we haven't mentioned that. I know that's been established, but that's really huge too. We see the Pope hanging out with trans people, like, okay, yeah, these are also just people.
Thanks, Max. Yeah, and I think what other people are bringing to this conversation, to this webinar, and perhaps to their ministries and their lives is a question of, well, what else should those of us who are trying to be good allies be doing? I think many people are don't necessarily are recognizing from some of these conversations this I don't know what I don't know, are trying to figure out how to best support trans people while respecting their agency and dignity, are trying to figure out how do I talk about this with my pastor, how do I talk about this with people I work with, how do I talk about this in a way that supports. And so I guess my question would be, what are some ways of doing that? What are the moral responsibilities as Catholics, as the baptized, for those of us who are not transgender or non-binary? What are our duties in order to serve, protect, to help support and walk with our trans siblings? So what are some of those ideas? So where should people start if they come off this webinar today and think, okay, I really want to help, I have no idea what to do?
Something I'd say, Brian, as a response to that, is, so, the previous question was, are trans people welcome in the church? And I think it's important, and I affirm that at a theological level, the answer is yes, trans people are welcome. But most people's experience of a church is not this abstract entity. Most people's experience of a church is a building that's on a particular street, and they know what's going on there, and they know, do I go in or do I go to brunch instead? Like that sometimes is the Sunday morning dilemma. And I think something that we can do is cut through a lot of the theological morass and talk about two things: respect and safety, right? How can, if you want a place where people are actually welcome and not merely invited into the space, you're going to have to make sure that the people who you are welcoming feel comfortable. And what are some of those minimum things? As Max mentioned, how to address someone with their name, addressing someone with the proper pronouns, making sure that there are places for them to go, bathrooms that are appropriate, right? I mean, these are things that show respect, right? And then also safety, right? Like everyone has dignity. Everyone should be at a minimum safe in our places, in our congregations. And so what does safety look like? We can't solve the big problem of homosexuality, blah, 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 but we can today make sure that every person coming into this sanctuary knows that this type of language is not acceptable, right? I think that is something that can be really well done and that we can do as a way to build the pathway towards these conversations. And for those of us who aren't in parishes that have professional theologians strutting about and trying to hide their faces, ask your pastor to be like, I want to discuss this. We have a right as Catholics to have an understanding of what our faith means. And if they aren't able to do that, I think it's important to be like, where should we go? How do we have this conversation in our parish? Because that's what we need to do. And I think that's our right. So I would say, you don't have to have professional degrees in theology to ask for, to organize towards respect and organize towards safety. I think those two things can be to set the groundwork for some of those richer conversations that we know have to happen down the line.
I
Max,
also,
closing ideas or thoughts about what we should be doing. Go ahead, Max.
I just wanted to throw in something that's maybe a little bit more subtle. And it's something that when I went through my transition, I was 28 when I started, just to give you an idea of how old I was and everything. Something that was very interesting for me in transitioning from a female role in society to a male role in society was processing how people respond to me differently, right? Okay, based on roles. And something that became obvious to me very quickly was suddenly now, because I'm a man, everybody is listening to me more or giving me the spotlight more and things like this. I know, shocking. And so the point I'm trying to make is that so as an ally to women, it's I have the opportunity to, in the subtle way, when I'm standing in a group of people and all the men are talking over the woman, I have the opportunity to kind of like shift the focus, right? And so I just wanted to say, or just to call up to mind that image and how we can do that, and that's kind of like a more subtle advocacy where we can raise and highlight the voices of people around us. Also, one last thing, which is, sometimes for the LGBTQ community, you may run into a situation where you are interfacing maybe with a more conservative person or with people that an individual that you're friends with or whatever may not be out to. And that can provide a challenge, because it may be, okay, I know that this person prefers this name and pronouns, but then how do I then turn around and talk to this person? And I just wanted to give this as a quick little example too, where what I do in those situations is I just kind of just move into the like non-binary like verbiage. So I just avoid referring to those pronouns and just referring to that person by name. It's not always easy, and you may make mistakes, and that's okay. But I just think that's another simple example where it's like, when you're in a conversation and that person is there and they notice that you're purposefully avoiding misgendering or outing that person, that is huge. And that's like a very pastoral, like not on this huge theological level, but you may actually encounter that. So I just wanted to throw that out there as another option.
Thanks, Matt. Therese, you get the last word with any thoughts.
Well, I mean, I also think, again, it's interesting that this isn't a document on human dignity and there's all these other examples of human dignity, right? Because if we're talking about our parishes, right, or our communities, I don't know about where you live, but like my parish, not so good with poor people, right? Do poor people feel welcome in my parish? I doubt that, right? Do I see a lot of poor people at Mass? Not really, right? Our parishes are still really bad about making even poor people feel welcome, right? People with disabilities, right? They're in the document too. I think it was maybe 35 years ago. I'll have to go back and look, right? But until very recently, people with cognitive disabilities were not allowed to receive the Eucharist, right? Because they didn't have the mental capacity to understand transubstantiation. When I found that out, I was appalled. Right now, this has since changed, at least in terms of teaching. I'm not sure about practice, right? But are most of our communities accommodating to people with disabilities? Heck no, right? I mean, so to really live this document, we would have to do a lot of changing. Just like making our parishes accommodating for people with disabilities, requires, moving the altar rail and putting in bathrooms and, doing substantial stuff with your space and with who you are. Like, ooh, pushes our comfort buttons having poor people sitting next to us in church, or people with disabilities making a lot of noise during Mass, or whatever, right? And so it's analogous with trans people, right? It's going to require learning, changing on our part, right? Not just saying, oh, you're invited into our space. That doesn't really work for you. That isn't going to make you feel welcome. And most of that work should not be on the trans people, right? We expect them to come educate everybody, educate the pastor, make sure. And that's too big of a burden to put on a very small community of people who are under attack in our church, right? So, I mean, I think in many ways the onus is on the rest of us, but it's also going to require significant change, which is good. It's that messy, constructive stuff that Craig was talking about earlier.
Well, thank you. And what I heard tonight, I heard a lot of things. I heard some of our frustration, some of our anger, some of our embarrassment at what came forward around transgender people in this document. But I also heard a lot of hope. I heard a lot of seeds for future growth. I heard a lot of nudges, pokes, invitations for conversion. Which I think is one of the fruits, the sort of strange fruits of this document coming out as it did when it did, is that we are actually now able to have a conversation, a wider conversation about how our church can better be the church. So I want to thank our speakers tonight for giving us some pathways to begin exploring how to do that. Therese Lysaught, Craig Ford, Max Kuzma. And then I'm going to pass it over to Bob Shine to give us some closing words about some of the other work that New Ways Ministry is doing.
Well, thank you to Therese, Craig, Max, Brian for helping us to break into a document that I think LGBTQ advocates will continue to have to look at, analyze, respond to, and help figure out where it fits in our ministries for inclusion and equality. One of the points that New Ways Ministry is trying to make sure gets out there is that Dignitas Infinita, despite its more critical remarks about gender theory and gender transitions, in no way says anything about stopping pastoral outreach and support for trans and non-binary people and their families. The work that so many of you are already doing in parishes and schools, nothing about the document says that we should stop that work. So I just want to say that New Ways Ministry is always here as a resource. We've published several commentaries, including one from Father Dan Horan on our blog, Bondings 2.0, which you can find on our website, newwaysministry.org. We also have a number of resources on gender identity questions, and we'll be having future webinars to look at issues related to gender identity in the church. So with that, I just have one last ask for those of you who've already made a donation in support of this webinar and other New Ways Ministry programs, thank you so much. If you would like to do so, I'm dropping a link into the chat, newwaysministry.org/donate. So we're very grateful for your support. And with that, I wish everyone a good evening or good rest of the day. Thank you for being here, and thank you very much for your commitment to equality for LGBTQ people in the Catholic Church. Take care.